When I was a kid, I used to watch The Muppet Show, and in The Muppet Show, they had this part called Pigs in Space. And I much prefer your analogy of horses in space because you use this to explain how we are much more dependent on and often limited by the past than we might think we are.
Absolutely. So the story then about horses in space goes like this. There are no horses in space, but you, being a smart and successful, clever person, should expect that there are precisely two horses in space. And while we're talking about horses in space, you should expect them to be 4 foot, 8.5 inches wide. And the reason why you should expect that is because that's the width that was used to determine the width of NASA's solid rocket boosters. Now, it wasn't coincidental that the rocket boosters are based on the width of two horses. It's specifically because of it being the width of two horses. And if you want to understand this riddle, you'd actually have to go really far back in time in Wikipedia, and you'd have to go back to the age of the Roman Empire. The Romans had the greatest land because they could patrol that land with the two-horse Roman war chariot. The war chariots tore up the dirt pathways of Europe, creating ruts everywhere. And if you were a little farmer driving your little wagon through the fields and through those ruts, you might break a wagon wheel. So if you were a clever farmer, you would measure the width of those ruts to make your new wagon the right width as the ruts. And you would learn that the ruts were spaced 4 foot 8.5 inches apart, just like the Roman war chariot. So pretty soon everyone with a wagon makes their wagon 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Then Europeans invent wagonways, which are carts that are pulled on rails by horses in and out of the gold mines. And they decide to put those rails 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Europeans then make the first trains and put them on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Americans are not connecting their tracks to Europe, but they still make them 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Pretty soon we gut all of the train tracks to make room for bigger, badder, faster trains that still run on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Some trains go 200 miles an hour on tracks that are 4 foot 8.5 inches wide, though there's some experimentation, but generally. And so when NASA needs to ship the solid rocket boosters from Utah to Florida, they must put them on a train track that is the width 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. Now, if you take a look, you'll notice that the solid rocket boosters overlap the width of the track a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that the width was determined loosely by the width of two horses' butts. Wow. Even though that just can't possibly be the perfect width for rocket boosters in space. The lesson goes to show you that we're more dependent on our past decisions than we like to think. All of these little haphazard decisions become standards, then it makes sense to follow the standard, and pretty soon we're making things for space based on the width of horses, even though there are no horses in space. That width is stupid, and we're probably worse off for it, but it is a metaphor I like to use when talking about the paths that we get stuck on. And in particular, I use a term called path dependency, which comes from the 1950s. And in Create the Future, I use that as the overarching metaphor. And I walk through 7 of the different traps of path dependency, which cause us to cling to the path we're on, whether it's Kodak deciding to keep making better digital prints or better prints instead of digital, or in your own world, sticking to that job, that career, that core product, that service, and having blinders on that block you from seeing the potential of your other pathways.